At noon that day, I walked into a loge in the Teatro Maliso, the lovely Renaissance salle where the poetry readings and the chamber music concerts were held every day of the Spoleto Festival, and suddenly saw Ezra Pound for the first time, sitting still as a Mandarin statue in a box at the back of the theater, one tier up from the stalls. It was a shock.
Lawrence Ferlinghetti at the Spoleto Festival in 1967, reading a poem about seeing Ezra Pound at the same event 2 years earlier.
I didn't recognize him in the first instance, seeing only a striking old man in a curious pose, thin, long-haired, aquiline at 80, head tilted strangely to one side, lost in some permanent abstraction.
The awe of Ferlinghetti's response to coming face to face with him permeates the whole poem and conveys the high regard that contemporary poets like the Beats held for the poetry of Pound, and the extraordinary fact of his very survival.
Everyone in the hall rose, turned, and looked back and up at Pound in his booth, applauding. The applause was prolonged, and Pound tried to rise from his armchair. A microphone was partly in the way. He grasped the arms of the chair with his bony hands and tried to rise. He could not, and he tried again and could not. A young Italian pulled the stand-up mic up close to Pound's face and held it there, and the voice came over, frail but stubborn, higher than I had expected, a thin, soft monotone.
What thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross. What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage.
The hall had gone silent at a stroke. The voice knocked me down, so soft, so thin, so frail, so stubborn still.
The ant's a centaur in his dragon world. Pull down thy vanity. It is not man made courage or made order or made grace. Pull down thy vanity, I say pull down.
I put my head on my arms on the velvet sill of the box. I was surprised to see a single tear drop on my knee. The thin, indomitable voice went on. Come to this.
This was near the end of Pound's life. He was to die just a few years later at the age of 87. But in this programme I want to go back across the years to the 1930s and early 1940s, to events in that life which were to remain ever after hugely controversial. 50 years ago this year, Ezra Pound was released from St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C. after 12 years of incarceration. On his release, he travelled to the homeland he'd made for himself in Italy, welcomed there by his family, including his daughter, at her home, the castle of Brennenburg in the Tyrol, where she still lives.
By the time he was finally released, although physically he gave the impression of being very strong and full of energy, he in effect wasn't. He was really worn out.
The 1958 reunion must have been quite a homecoming.
It certainly was a homecoming, and we being so overjoyed and still young and full of beans, didn't realize of how he had resisted all those years. I mean, by concentrating so hard in order to keep his sanity in the madhouse, because that's what it boiled down to.
Mary Rakovilts is Ezra's daughter by Olga Rudge, a gifted violinist he'd met in Paris in 1922. Together with his wife Dorothy Shakespeare, Olga was to form part of an often difficult ménage à trois, which continued until the end of his life.
Pound went to live in Italy in 1924. That's where, at that time, he believed the interesting action to be, the interesting intellectual life. And by that he meant particularly Mussolini's program for social reform. There were two sides to fascism: the thuggery, which imposed the totalitarian regime and the intent of bringing about a changed situation in which people would have enough to eat, would have good housing, in which the agriculture and the industry would all be improved.
Professor A. David Moody of York University is Pound's latest biographer, now working on his second volume of the life, exploring exactly this period.
And he lived there from 1924 until 1945, and then again after he was released from prison in 1958. He lived in Rapallo, which was a seaside town, a resort town, very pleasant situation just south of Genoa. And from there he wrote an immense amount of poetry, of journalism, of propaganda.
Session number 483, an almost inaudible Ezra Pound.
I've come to the Imperial War Museum in London. I'm in a reading room, listening room, and I'm about to listen to a recording made in this country of one of Ezra Pound's wartime broadcasts. February the 19th, 1942.
The Italian radio, opinion by those who are qualified to hold it, following the tradition of Italian hospitality, has offered Dr. Ezra Pound the use of the microphone twice goes against his conscience, or anything incompatible with his duties as a citizen of the United States of America.
Those words, drafted by Ezra Pound and spoken by an announcer on Rome Radio, always preceded his broadcasts. They're very indistinct, so it's quite important to understand what was actually said there, as Pound later was using this material as evidence that he was not committing treason by making these broadcasts. This is what he said. Rome Radio, acting in accordance with the fascist policy of intellectual freedom and free expression of opinion by those who are qualified to hold it, has offered Dr. Ezra Pound the use of the microphone twice a week. It is understood that he will not be asked to say anything whatsoever that goes against his conscience or anything incompatible with his duties as a citizen
of the United States of America.
Part of his defence, subsequently, was that he was simply upholding one of the most cherished rights of an American citizen, the freedom of speech.
Europe calling, Ezra Pound speaking.
He analysed the causes of that war as being basically economic. He believed that international finance was behind the war in order to make profits out of it, by armaments, by the way in which it would shake up the world situation, the imperial preference and that kind of thing. And he believed banking was behind it. He wasn't recruited by Rome Radio. In fact, there was a lot of resistance put up by the fascist authorities. They weren't keen at all on having Pound on. With reason, because he wasn't interested in broadcasting their propaganda. He wanted to broadcast his own propaganda. And that's what he did. He wrote, over the course of the war, about 500 programs in all, short 7-minute programs. He himself recorded about 300. So he was broadcasting over Rome Radio, and he was broadcasting, it would appear, on behalf of the enemy, even though what he was saying was entirely his own thinking and not at all on behalf of the fascist war effort.
The President has no more legal right to do these infamies than you have to sign my name on a check or I yours. There is no darkness save ignorance.
Just stop there for a moment and examine some of the things that Pound is saying there. The reference to checks and the name on a check. This is a recurring theme, of course, of Pound's obsession with economy and the way the economy of the United States was governed. And you do get these lines in these texts that are almost like something out of the cantos. There's a sort of poetry about some of them. The president hath no power is how he begins. There is no darkness save ignorance.
The Allies won that war and then cheated Italy. That was an error. The cheating of Italy was an error, and Lloyd George ought to know it by now. The cheating of Italy was an error.
My idea, when I worked on editing the radio speeches were actually a working up or warming up for the next batch of cantos, which then happened to be the peasant cantos.
those radio broadcasts do include passages which were part of the P's and cantos, as it were, in manuscripts. There are passages of what is basically poetry in process.
Dr. Helen Dennis of the Department of English at Warwick University and the editor of a book of essays on Pound. Here's one of a number of contradictions we'll come to in this programme: the states of mind in which the poems and the broadcasts were created.
It is possible to read him as remaining in complete control of his faculties whilst he is writing poetry, but tending towards a kind of mania when he gets on his political hobby horse. So there's a kind of strange tension between a sort of fixed dogmatic viewpoints on the one hand and this incredible kind of openness to experience on the other. And it's there in the radio broadcasts as it is in a lot of the poetry.
It was an eerie sensation. He was sort of, trying to get rid in his prose of everything superfluous and everything spurious almost, in order to sort of come down and then be able to sing again.
Pull down thy vanity, I say, pull down. Learn of the green world what shall be thy place in scaled invention or true artistry. Pull down thy vanity, if I can pull down.
He was completely unusual as a poet to take this kind of interest in economics. It was one of the ways in which he was a revolutionary poet. He wanted to change the way people perceived the world in order to improve the world, to reform it. He wanted to do that through poetry, but he was impatient. Poetry takes a long time to change people's perceptions, and you can't guarantee that it is going to change the way people see the world and behave in it. And this is why he engaged also in prose propaganda.
But that any sub-Jew in the White House should send American lads to die for the Jew-soons and Sassoons and the private interest.
Pound's poetics express themselves in wordplay, often unacceptable wordplay, it has to be said. Here we have the Jew-soons, Sassoons, Jew-soons, Sassoons. He was very fond of using the word Jew in various quite clever ways, but nevertheless deeply unattractive ways. He would refer to Roosevelt as Jewsevelt, refer to the newspapers as the Jews' papers. He'd talk about usury as Jewsery.
From Omaha to Singapore to die for British monopoly and brutality is not the act of an American
Roosevelt is more in the hands of the Jews than Wilson was in 1919, or should I say Jewsvelt. Europe calling, Pound speaking, Ezra Pound speaking, Ezra Pound speaking.
Who's that? Sounds familiar. It's me. It's Ezra. It's Uncle Ezra from Rome, the star turn. Oh, I must spruce myself up. I'm putting on my top hat. I'm entering the studios. I smell clean and vigorous, Abram. I'm about to enter my own voice. I sit at the table, the microphone before me, the lights flick on. I am about to make my famous broadcast.
I recommend for reading purposes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
In 1981, Bernard Copps's play Ezra was produced almost simultaneously for the stage and for radio. Copps is one of Britain's leading post-war dramatists. He's also Jewish, which makes Ezra Pound perhaps an unusual choice of subject for a play.
February 1942, that any Jew in the White House should send American kids to die for the private interests of the scum of the English earth and the still lower dregs of the Levantine. Ezra Pound speaking.
I love his poetry. I remember reading, "What thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross. What thou lovest well shall not be rest from thee."
What thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross. What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage.
I thought it was fantastic. And then I tried to read the P's and Cantos, not understanding really, but loving the sound of it. So I read him. Then came the greatest shock of all, when I discovered his anti-Semitism. Now, I had most of my relatives, I think 99% of them all killed in the Holocaust. Consequently, I thought, I didn't want to know about him, but I thought, hang on, think about it. How can he be a great poet and also have these incredible obscene views? And it was on that led me into trying to find out more.
Your play, in a sense, is a sort of working out at trying to understand those two sides of Pound.
Yes, except that I do come to an understanding, I think. I was chided for being too nice to Pound. There was a justifiable anger and hatred against the man. Emmanuel Litvinov said, "Bernard, how could you write a play like that?"
You have been fed lies! Don't shoot! Don't shoot him! Don't shoot the president! Assassins deserve worse, but don't shoot him! Just which of you are free from Jewish influence? Just which political and business groups are free from Jewish influence? From Jew control? Who holds the mortgages? Who is that dominating director? Just which Jew...
I've come to the National Archives at Kew Gardens, where there are a number of files relating to Ezra Pound. One of the most interesting things is right at the top of this particular file, where there is a memo clearly from American security forces to their equivalents in this country. As far back as 1918, it's dated the 14th of November 1918, and it says, "Will you kindly have inquiries made regarding Ezra Pound, 5 Holland Place Chambers, Church Street, Kensington. His name and address were found among the papers of a seditious Indian in America, and he now writes a somewhat mysterious letter to a friend in Chicago." It's interesting that so early on, Pound was being a figure of some considerable interest to security forces. Here, for example, is an intercepted letter that Pound wrote in 1940 to Oswald Mosley. "Whatever happens, we must educate and keep on educating at least the few blokes who can stand education of any kind."
Master thyself, then others shall thee bear. Pull down thy vanity.
There are little footnotes to the story that one comes across through browsing through documentation like this, including this, a letter to Mrs. Pound relating to her son Omar, who was at Charterhouse School. This is an intercepted letter, and it's dated the 3rd of October 1941, and says, "Dear Mrs. Pound, Omar has developed a total dislike of Charterhouse, and I feel that if he remains, his health will be impaired. The trouble has, I believe, arisen owing to reports received of his father's activities. He naturally defends his parents, and in doing so gives offence to other boys whose parents are no doubt engaged in the common war effort. He's reached the age when, by pondering over your early letters, he's begun to think for himself, and on the extreme views of the war which were sent to him by you, anti-British, anti-America and pro-fascist." All the boys knew about his father. The trouble is he is in sympathy with Italy and will air his views in a brave endeavour to interpret your own views. What a sad little story. Basically, what is being said here is, take your son away. And clearly Omar was a neglected figure, a sad figure, rather abandoned on the shores of this story.
The thin, indomitable voice went on, "Come to this."
When the war ended, Pound tried to give himself up. At first, the American forces weren't interested, but when they changed their mind, they caged him, literally, at a detention camp near Pisa. David Moody's investigated in great detail the conditions under which this 60-year-old poet was held.
When he got there, he was put into one of the cages, which were called the death cells. These were concrete-floored cages with wire around their walls. They were about 10 feet by 6 feet or something like that, a flat tar paper roof, and open to the elements, open to the dust, the sun, the glare, the wind, the rain, everything. And Pound was put into one of these cages, but it was also reinforced with a kind of metal strips that they used to create landing areas for planes during the war. So these metal strips had been welded on to the outside of the cage to make it extra secure. He was there for 3 weeks. The guards given orders not to talk to him. His food was sort of shoved through to him. He was not let out for exercise. He had no books, nothing at all. He was just simply shut up in this cage 24 hours a day. And at night there was a glaring light on him.
A man is pacing in his cage. The balance of his mind seems to be impaired. This man is me. This cage is my cage. 6 feet by 6.5. I pace 2 paces by 2, 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. Gorilla cage.
And after 3 weeks, the doctor in the camp said, well, he was undergoing a breakdown and that this was likely to cause him, if not death, at least cause severe harm to him.
I, Ezra Pound, am pacing in a cage.
Now, what was interesting was I just had a vision of Ezra in his gorilla cage in Pisa, and I thought, oh, my God, if you can't go nowhere, you can go everywhere. It's the man going quite mad, or is going quite mad, and all sorts of images are coming to him in a sort of chronological order. That's really how the play was born.
And T.S. Eliot. His sparse style has a dramatic impact upon poetry.
He becomes one of the greatest poets of the 20th century.
All other poets and artists revere him. So what is he doing in this cage? Why is one of the greatest poets of the world pacing in a small steel cage?
How did he come to this?
How? Why?
The cage is a sort of continuing metaphor through the whole play.
Yeah. In fact, when it was done in the theatre at the Half Moon, they took the cage and what they did is they turned it into a giant head, and everything that happened went on inside the head.
Much did go on inside Ezra's head, but it became clear that he wasn't the dangerous criminal he'd been marked down as, and the medical authorities at the camp instigated a more humane regime.
He was taken out and accommodated in an army pup tent in the medical compound. He did have a proper bed, proper shelter. He could also exercise in the medical compound area, and at night and the evenings he was able to use the medical centre's typewriter. He had taken in with him a copy of Confucius. He had trained himself to read and understand Chinese, and he was very interested, very committed to Confucian thinking. He found an anthology of poetry. He read that. But the main activity during the rest of his time in the camp, through the remaining 5 months or so, was to compose the Pisan cantos. This is a long poem of about 100 pages, an immense effort of reconstruction, personal reconstruction of his own mind and thinking, but an attempt to reconstruct his perception of, well, the world.
Thou art a beaten dog beneath the hail, a swollen magpie, a fitful sun, half black, half white, nor knowst thou wing from tail.
It's an act at the end of the war of reconstruction. That's the remarkable thing, the being shut up in the cage and suffering that's one aspect. But that he should after that write this immensely powerful, long poem, which drew upon memory, constructed out of the memory, his best poetry. That was an enormous achievement.
Pull down thy vanity, how mean thy hates fostered in falsity. Pull down thy vanity.
He's clearly trying to rewrite 20th century poetics, moving away from fixed poetic form. But for him, that doesn't mean just giving way to a kind of free verse that has no form. So that his mind is still thinking in terms of the way a poet traditionally thinks, that a poem is language which is organised with more patterning than prose, and that patterning comes through repetition. Now, traditionally, the repetition is in sound rhyme, but it is quite possible for there to be subject rhymes. If you want leitmotif rhymes, feeling there are things which relate to one another even if they are not quite the same. So other kinds of patternings emerge, other ways of trying to read the universe.
Initially, Pound as prisoner faced a future even bleaker than the weeks of torment in the heat and dust of Pisa. He was taken to the USA, to Washington, D.C., facing an indictment for treason based on the Rome broadcasts. But the trial of Ezra Pound was in fact the trial that never was.
When it came to the actual moment of trial, psychiatrists had been appointed by the state and by his own defence team to examine him, and the psychiatrists gave testimony not that he was insane, but that he was in a paranoid state, and they used a few other terms, schizoid, which rendered him not in a fit state to understand his situation and to plead guilty or not guilty. The state, I think, was quite happy about this because they were uncertain whether they could prove their case against Pound. They had difficulty with finding the necessary 2 witnesses to the broadcasts. There was the question of intention, the fundamental problem for them. And I think the state was quite happy not actually to go to trial. His defence team were probably quite happy also because they were uncertain of the outcome. It was a time in which Pound, because of the public feeling, might have been found guilty in spite of his good case and might have faced execution. So it suited perhaps all parties to have him committed to an institution for the criminally insane in Washington, D.C. St. Elizabeth's it was called, is called, still exists.
And so I to the nut house, to St. Elizabeth's, straight out of sunlight, straight down into hell.
And he was committed to that sine die without any particular time limit, simply in order to put him out of the way, I suppose. And he remained there for the next over 12 years.
How much contact did you have with him during the St. Elizabeth's years?
Well, only by letter. I only was able to visit him once in 1953.
It was a place filled with the really insane people in all kinds of mad states, some violent, most of them very disturbed, totally delusional. And he was first of all put in a ward with people who were in a very disturbed state.
I am declared an insane criminal.
Certainly he was in a state of mental exhaustion and to some extent breakdown, but he was not out of his mind. For someone who was in his mind, basically, this must have been very hellish too.
Am I come to this?
What do you feel about the way he was treated? Do you think that was vindictive on the part of the American government? Is there any comparison with some of the things we read about going on in, I don't know, Guantanamo Bay today?
Well, it certainly was vindictive of all the academia and all the people he had insulted. And yes, it was also vindictive.
I don't know that there was any malice in the American government position. There is, of course, a parallel with declaring people insane when they're being politically dissenters in order to get them out of the way. We know how much that was done in Soviet Russia. We're not entirely free of it now. But I'm not sure that that was the case, because if the defence team had insisted on a trial, as Pound wanted to plead his case, to argue his side, if that had happened, then I think the prosecution would have had to let the trial go ahead. So it's his defence team agreeing, in effect, with the state that led to his being committed to the institution.
Everything was used against him. They didn't catch the irony of some of his speeches. Anyway, I'm glad he made them. That's all I can say.
It did put him out of the way. But Pound was not a threat. He was not treated as if he were going to be a threat. A quite different situation from Guantanamo.
While Ezra was in St. Elizabeth's, the Pisan cantos were published. In 1948, the work won the Library of Congress's Bollingen Prize for the best poem of the year. The award provoked violent controversy. Robert Frost said it was an unendurable outrage, adding that he thought Pound was quite possibly crazy, but more likely criminal. The journalist Walter Winchell claimed Ezra had told him, on hearing the news, that democracy is more stupid than ever I said it was, although Pound later claimed Winchell had made it up, calling him a Jewish bedbug.
He adopted anti-Semitism. He adopted it because he wanted to stir up anger against the banking habit of usury.
It started really with the gold standard. It started with the First World War, when he was genuinely, absolutely distraught at the loss of so many young lives.
Walked I deep in hell, believing in old men's lies, then unbelieving. Came home to a lie, home to many deceits, home to old lies and new infamy, usury age-old and age-thick, and liars in public places.
He wanted to develop a passionate antagonism to hatred of what he saw as the abuse of the credit system by banking.
The usura cantos would be more comprehensible if people will understand the meaning of the term usury. It is not to be confused with legitimate interest, which is due teleologically, as Delmar says, to the increase in domestic animals and plants. The difference between a fixed charge and a share or proportion of an increase. Now, usury is a charge for the use of purchasing power levied without regard to production, often without regard even to the possibilities of production. And the famous Medici Bank went bust when they started taking more deposits than they could invest in legitimate commerce and started making loans to princes, which were non-productive loans.
It's hard to disagree with Pound's thinking there in the light of the transatlantic credit-crunching 21st century and the collapse of banks across continents. The problem, and it's the big central problem, is Pound's fanatical idea of its cause.
For some reason, this calumny about Jews being in control of the money, with that plus the war, kind of obsessed him.
And he developed that in his broadcasts and in his prose propaganda by accusing bankers of being Jews and Jews of being usurers.
He even wrote a poem, didn't he, about usury, which is a wonderful poem, you know.
All right then, Canto 45. With usura hath no man a house of good stone, each block cut smooth and well-fitting, that design might cover their face. With usura hath no man a painted paradise on his church wall, harpes et lute.
He got it wrong. He got the politics wrong. I don't think he even got the economics right. But what he does do is give us this poem that shows us a kind of flawed mirror of a very flawed century, with its moments of beauty, its moments of aspiration, and with its terrible tragedies. And I think towards the end of his life, he also acknowledged that he had included error and that maybe had to be part of the process, inevitably.
No picture is made to endure nor to live with, but it is made to sell and sell quickly.
Was he personally anti-Semitic?
No, of course not. This is the crux of the matter, to be quite frank. No, I haven't yet met any Jew who has felt the slightest trace, if they have met him personally. All our friends, now that one thinks back of the days in Venice, I mean, they all just happened, or almost all happened to be Jews.
Leon da Modena, Emmanuel Bassano, Benjamin and Sara Lopanzo, where are you?
And I felt very sorry in a way that this man who was such a genius could sink so low. But it does rather represent the story of humankind.
And I think that comes through right at the very end of the play, where he's calling out to the Jewish ghetto in in Venice, calling, as it were, to ghosts to...
Can I just read this
Yes.
bit a minute, because it touches me every time I read it. They are nice Jews, good, decent, human, hard-working, proud Jews. They know me. They smile as I pass. They call me maestro. They are indistinguishable from Italians. They are all the sort of the earth Jews. Listen, listen, I will call them in their houses. They will come out for me.
Come out! Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?
Where are they? I was never against them. Why are the houses empty?
I was never against them.
It was all a joke.
Joke ended in smoke.
The wind. I was never against them. It was all a joke. Yes, Ezra, joke ended in smoke.
The question of his eventual release was one that took a long time to resolve. But in the end, with a lot of pressure, mainly behind the scenes from T.S. Eliot, from Hemingway, from Archibald MacLeish, there were public figures, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary-General of the United Nations, with another voice urging the release of Pound publicly. So there came the point at which he could be released, and at that point Robert Frost, who was a public figure, a poet who was thoroughly acceptable to the American public, came into the picture.
Robert Frost's part in the release is, to say the least, surprising, considering his strong opposition to the awarding of the Bollingen Prize to Pound and the fact that he thought nothing of his poetry. It had been an article about Ezra's literary essays in a 1954 edition of the New York Times Book Review that drew to Frost's attention the fact that Ezra had written enthusiastically about his 1914 collection, North of Boston, at a time when Frost was virtually unknown, that persuaded him to join the campaign for Pound's freedom.
When Frost came out and said yes, he should be released, that enabled the government to do so in a way that the public found acceptable. So in 1958, he was released into his wife's care and keeping because he was still regarded as a person who was not fit to manage his own affairs, and that remained the case until his death.
Mint grows at the foot of the snow range. The first moon is the tiger's.
Ezra went back to stay initially with his daughter Mary and her husband Boris at their home at the castle of Brennenburg. Having not been able to speak to him for so long, she was struck by the quality, the clarity of his voice.
Pheasant calls out of bracken. Rossoni, cosi lo stato.
When he first came here in 1958, it was absolutely very, very clear and resonant the way he read the cantos to us. And he would read Uncle Remus to the children in the evening. I mean, he was still enjoying it.
And listening to this recording made by the BBC producer D.G. Brideson of Pound reading in that year, we can hear something of what she heard.
Snowflakes at a hand's breadth and rain. Trees line the banks, mostly willows. Kublai, Tay of Ch'eng, called Timor, 1247, came hither. Forest through ice into emerald.
After tea, every day we would all gather and he would read the cantos. I was at that time such a young fool that when Boris said, "Oh, let's record them," I said, "Oh, no, this is for the family. We are not going to record this for the public." Of course, now I regret it deeply because, I mean, he did read magnificently and joyfully at the time.
The green spur, the white meadow, may their pond be full, the son have his father's arm and good hearing. Noun graph upright, adjective sideways, his horse's mane flowing, his body and soul are at peace.
And so Ezra Pound's trial was over. Or was it? Will it ever be over? Now, today, even after examining this extraordinary chapter in his long life, the two fundamental questions are not completely answered in my mind. Did he commit treason? And was he insane?
On the face of it, to be broadcasting over the enemy radio, programs directed to America, on the face of it, that's to be giving aid and comfort to the enemy. But in the case of the United States particularly, its law requires not only that you do that, broadcast over enemy radio, but that you do it with the intent of harming the United States. And Pound clearly had no intention of harming the United States. He was trying to reform it economically and to return it to its basic principles. Technically, in one sense, it was treasonable, but legally, when you come down to the matter of intention, which is an essential element, then I think he would have had to be cleared.
Is any poet sane? I think if you're totally sane, you probably can't write poetry. He had exaggerated aspects to his personality. On the other hand, he had this strong urge to quest for a sense of balance, not a simple, simplistic sense of balance, but a complex balancing act within a very precarious, unpredictable world.
Anyone who is able to understand, let alone write poetry, knows that the truth lies in the beauty of the work. Now the rest is just scum. I mean, there is a lot of scum around every gem.
And that every plant hath its seed, so will the weasel eat rue and the swallows nip celandine. And as engraven on gold to be unity, but duality brass and trine to mercurial, shall a tetrad be silver with the smoke of nutmeg and frankincense.
Ezra Pound's final 10 years were spent with Olga Rudge in Venice. In 1972, 2 days after his 87th birthday, he died. He'd wanted to be buried in the United States, but this was denied him. His grave is on the Venetian island of San Maggiore.
I went blind from the box, through the back door of it, into the empty upper corridor of the theater, where they still sat turned to him, went down and out into the sunlight, weeping.
It had been 7 years before that Lawrence Ferlinghetti had seen him at the Spoleto Festival at one of his last appearances, and was moved to create his own poem of beauty out of the memory of Ezra Pound and his voice.
The sun shone on the chestnut trees, and the leaves turned in the sun, and turned, and turned, and turned, and would continue turning. His voice went on, through the leaves.
But to have done instead of not doing, this is not vanity. To have with decency knocked that a blunt should open, to have gathered from the air of live tradition, or from a fine old eye the unconquered flame, this is not vanity. Here error is all in the not done, all in the diffidence that faltered.